Alright, today we'll be changing out the center differential in a 2005 Saab 92X Aero. This is the same as a 2002 to 2004 Subaru WRX. Also well known, most of the Subarus we've encountered, it's relatively the same steps. So what we're going to do first to drain the transmission fluid, use the main drain plug right here. After we drain the fluid, our next step is going to be to remove the turbo back. After we remove the exhaust, our next step is going to be to get up here to the drive shaft, and unfortunately back here we have to remove the skid guard. What we will be doing is accessing these 4 bolts that are in here. All we have to contend with after that will be our center bearing support for our drive shaft. That's going to be these 2 bolts, and then after we get that out, it'll be nothing more than just a little bit of tension on it and then just slide it right out. Alrighty, so after removing the drive shaft, we're going to separate the cross member that holds the transmission into place. We're going to loosen these bolts, this bolt, that bolt, followed by there are 4 bolts that actually secure the bracket and also a mount to the transmission, which is going to be this one and that one. You can see that, and then also the same thing on the other side. Before removing this, we will make sure to support the transmission in this generalized area with a block of wood and either a jack stand if you're doing it on the ground, or luckily for us, we're going to be using a garage, so a T-stand. After supporting the jack, we will completely remove this bar, and then the transmission will be just relatively sitting in there. The only point that's going to be holding it will be the stand here, and then the motor mount, or I'm sorry, the bell housing mount to the back of the Subaru block. After we do that, we have to access and remove the shifter linkage. And first and foremost, what we'll try to do is get this bracket removed, which has 2 bolts which are located right up here. With the cross member out of the way, it's going to be a lot easier to see. It's on the other side of that. And then also these 2 bolts that are right up in this area. There's one here and then one here. Again, with all this out of the way, it's going to be much more easier and you'll be able to see much more clearly. After removing those, this is a little ball socket. That's it's kind of weird coming out and going in, but all you have to do is just apply a little bit of downward pressure while someone holds the shifter in the top, just so that you can separate the ball and socket. And then when you reverse it, it's just the same way, just gentle, and add some grease. After removing that, then we'll have access to the actual physical shifting rod, which is this bracket that you can see right here with the little rubber boot on it. And you see right up in here, those are your pivot points. If you can see where my finger is pointing, there is a little circle. Those are actually 2 roll pins that are inside of each other. And that is what secures the shifter rod to the actual shifter fork that goes inside of the back of the transmission. So what we'll have to do is, with all this out of the way, it'll have access to a drift punch, and with any luck, we'll be able to find the right size, punch out the inner one, and then with any luck, the bottom one will either drop out or it might just require a little bit of a tap out. After removing that, you'll have the whole back side of the transmission that's going to be exposed, to which we will begin unbolting the bolts that separate the whole back side of the cover. Alrighty, so actually this is what the back of the tail housing looks like, the transmission rear housing. As it sits in the car, this is actually what it looks like, is this position. And as you can see, you have where your output shaft would be, and then there's your oil seal that's in there. And then this is where your shifter fork will go in. And then on the inside, as you remove it, you will have, this is your actual center diff and your center differential bearing. That is what usually is causing your whining and grinding when you're just going down the road. All right, so I'm going to be breaking the exhaust nuts, or the exhaust bolts free off of the turbo.
Breaking these nuts.
Alrighty. After removing the exhaust manifold bolts, we're going to make sure that we disconnect all of the O2 sensors. We will then remove the rubber bushings holding the exhaust in place.
Cool tool, right? Wow, look how big that exhaust is. Holy moly.
Alrighty, we're going to remove the drain plug for the transmission. I recommend gloves for this time because gear fluid is some very, very nasty stuff. Got a drain pan situated underneath it. It's a 21 millimeter. I would recommend using either a wrench or a ratchet. Don't use air tools or any electric tools. Yummy in my tummy. 14 millimeter, and I'm going to go ahead and take them off. I'm already using a 12 millimeter wrench. You have to use either a pry bar in between the yokes, or you can attempt to put it into first gear to maintain the shaft. But alrighty, we're rotating the shaft around after removing the bottom 2 bolts. Make sure the vehicle is in neutral and the e-brake's off. If you have all 4 tires elevated, all you need to do is just take 1 tire and turn. Bada bing. We're going to leave 1 bolt left in the shaft at the propeller end, and then we're going to take off these 2, the bearing carrier bolts, which are both the 14 millimeter. Do not loosen it up completely unless you have some sort of weight or pressure being applied to the bolt. And then just gently let it slacken. After removing all 4 of the bolts, with pressure applied to the shaft, you can wiggle it, or sometimes you have to use a little bit of a hammer force just to kind of loosen that up. All right, go ahead. And just like that. And then taking care of the center bearing, you just pull the shaft right on out. Your drain plug again, if you went that method, make sure to clean off the little magnet. That is a magnet, and that'll have like particulates in there. I've already done that. So then you can either replace the crush plug, which is a copper or an aluminum ring around the top rim, or you don't have to. I do. And then using a wrench, only a wrench or a ratchet. Just bring it so it's snug, and then just a little. That's it. We've applied the T-post here underneath the transmission, directly on the transmission. We got a piece of wood that's separating the metal. That way it's some sort of dampening. First step is going to be removing the actual physical mounts. 14 millimeter, a swivel. That'd be the handiest. And just move this side over here. Next, we're going to start removing with the 2 bolts on both sides here. They're a 14 millimeter. This is your 17 millimeter. Alrighty, we're removing this bracket, and we're using a 12 millimeter deep well 6-point. After removing those 3 bolts, this will be released. Then you'll have to follow up with these 2 up here. Use the same setup, a 12 millimeter deep socket. Pair of external snap ring pliers. We're going to locate the little plastic cap that's located on the base of the shifter. We're going to put them in there. We sprayed ours down just, to reduce on that rust and maybe help us. And oh yeah, just like that. Handy tool here, a punch holder, and I also have a drift pin punch, and hopefully I can get it out. Now this is a 2-stage. There's 2 pieces of this pin. There's an inner one, and then there's an outer one. The first stage is the inner one. Alrighty, so I'm using a piece of wood to just put between the actual transmission, and then I'm sticking it against the fork. I'm going to bring it back, you'll feel it go into gear, and then it's just essentially using gentle pressure just to get it off of the shaft there. The shaft back, and then I have a bungee cord, and then I just stick it over to some point on the side for holding it out of the way, and then we begin taking apart the bolts, which are 14 millimeters. Alrighty, after removing the bolts, I'm going to set that aside. I've got a drain pan underneath the bottom of the pan. I'm going to take a flathead screwdriver and see if maybe there's anything I can wiggle. We're going to break it loose. There's going to be some fluid that comes out. Alrighty, we're going to take a piece of wood here, just lightly tap on it. Now we just cracked it open. We use the hammer and a piece of wood, tapped against the end of the, right in that area. Now we're getting the fluid to come out, and as you can see, even with it being drained, there's still fluid in there, so we'll just let that sit there and drain for a little while. Alright, so after you pull it, you get the dowel pins unseparated. Very carefully, she's a little bit awkward, but you want to carefully bring her straight out. You have a shaft on the top that's floating, so if you kind of tip it towards you, you're going to get fluid on you, but it's going to keep a shaft from popping out. And right straight down. Alright. Good bearing?
that bearing?
We have to remove all these gears and inspect them after removing the case. Check for any damage. Then replace all that there is damage. As you can see, there is damage on all of these. Same with the case. We're replacing everything on the back differential partition. Cover, center differential, and the two shafts. Alrighty, so we're using ultra gray Permatex art. We're doing an extremely light layer around it because we're looking at tolerances. So a little tiny bit goes a long way. Just make sure you get a decent even coat so that everything looks like it's pretty well covered. And then we're going to assemble the shaft in there with lubricant and put it on the car and let it set. And then... Alright, using a cross pattern after we reinstall everything with a nice clean lip and RTV sealant. Using a cross pattern, we're going to slowly bring it in until it's just barely touching. You'll see some of the RTV start to touch. And we're going to let it sit there, following the directions of the RTV for the proper cure time. And then we'll tighten based off of those directions. Alright, so we're doing a 27.5 foot-pounds of torque and a cross pattern sequence starting from the center and then working our way clockwise. Alright, after torquing the rear cover on the transmission, we're going to pretty much do the reverse of everything that we did to get to it.